This discussion is going to be on gap analysis. So for gap analysis, there's certain pieces of data that you must have. You need to know what is expected of the individual. So some sort of benchmark data, fall and spring, or you could do comparison data with a peer during the intervention period. You need the average number of weeks of the school if you're going to use benchmark data. You just need to know the number of the weeks of the intervention if you're going to use typical peer data. Median baseline for the target student, median post-test for the target student. So you should always have 3 data points before the student even starts the intervention and 3 data points after the intervention is over. Not the last 3 data points of the intervention, 3 data points after the intervention is over. From those, for this, you're going to use the median score. So if there's a score of 32, 43, and 37, you're going to use 37. So it's the middlemost score. And then you need to know the number of weeks left in the school year for the targeted child. So there's a gap analysis worksheet, and really within the worksheet, these are the 3 things that the worksheet kind of helps you work through. First is there a gap? And then the second is the child, what is their rate of improvement? And what is the average rate of improvement? How different are those? And then finally, what do we need to do for the child to bridge the gap? And is the intervention that's currently working, is it practical to think that if we let it keep going, that it will eventually bridge the gap? So the worksheet has these 3 different steps. Step 1 is the determination of the gap. Step 2 is determining the rate of improvement. And step 3 is the progress needed. I'm going to take just a second and talk a little bit about rate of improvement. So under here I have it as average child is the difference score of the spring minus fall benchmark divided by the number of weeks. On average, a school year is 40 weeks. That gives you the average student's rate of improvement. And that makes sense. How much did they improve all throughout the year divided how many weeks there are in a year. So when I was talking earlier about using typical peer data, well, if you're not using benchmark data, let's say that you're using behavioral observation data. Well, with a rate of improvement then, you would have different scores where you have the median pre and post for the typical peer, and then a median pre and post, median pre and post for the typical peer. And you would subtract those. And then you would divide that by the number of weeks of the intervention. So really, to get average student rate of improvement, if you're going to use a typical peer, it's going to look almost identical to the calculation used for the target student's rate of improvement. Okay, and I know that may seem a little confusing, but it should make more sense as you go through. And so let's go through each of these. Step 1, is there a gap? So if we determine a gap of up to 2.0, it's considered significant in elementary school. I tend to use that as a general guideline across the board. So this is what this might look like for a mythical person named Michael here. So with this, we have the information we just talked about. The current benchmark performance for the child, his current rate of improvement, and the benchmark expectation, an end-of-year benchmark expectation, so where he is now and where he's supposed to be, and the number of weeks left in the year. So this is all the kind of information we just talked about. So you would fill in this take some of this information that you have and fill in some of the parts of the table. So first would be the current benchmark expectation data, then you would have the current performance data, and then you get the current gap. So when we did that, we have a gap of 1.35. It's not quite the 2.0 we would need, and so the gap is not significant. Okay? So with this, some might choose to stop the gap analysis after this, the idea being that maybe his gap is not big enough that he even needs an intervention. But let's proceed and look at some of the other options here. So how quickly is he learning compared to his peers? So we're going to do this through a rate of improvement worksheet. So again, we have data. We need his student scores on the first probe administered or last probe administered. Ideally, you would have the student scores on the median baseline and the median post, but here we go. Then the fall benchmark expectation and the spring benchmark expectation. So from this, you can take the spring benchmark expectation, subtract the fall benchmark expectation, and so that tells you how much the child was expected to grow, like the average kid grew that number of points, that difference between spring and fall. And the total number of weeks, average in a school district is 40 weeks. So the average student is improving by 0.65. Okay. Then we calculate his. So here you go. We have the same data. We have his score on his last probe. Ideally, it would be the median score. And then we have score on his first probe. Again, median baseline score. Number of weeks. So this is the number of weeks that the intervention took place. And so his average rate of improvement was 0.69. So he is actually improving at a greater rate than the average child is. But just because he's improving at a greater rate, is he going to be able to, in the time that's left, catch up to where we really would like for him to be? Again, it wasn't a significant gap that we saw, but there was a gap there. So the question is he going to be able to close that gap? So let's calculate whether or not his rate of improvement is reasonable. So remembering the end of the year benchmark was 60, his current performance is 37, and the difference is 23 points. So he needs to improve by 23 points from where he is to the end of the school year. So we put in that 23 points down here. And how many weeks are left in the end of the school year? Well, there's 13 weeks left. So we're basically saying, how much does he have to improve each week in order for him to catch up to where the other kids are? And he would need to improve by 1.8 points each week. Now, one thing to look at here is we look at his current difference score. His current ROI is not 1.8. And so we now can look at this another way, which is it would take him 33 weeks to catch up. But there's only 13 weeks left in the semester. Is this reasonable? Well, the idea of reasonable is that a reasonable ROI is one in which is no more than twice the ROI of typical peers. So over here, 2 times the typical ROI. For our example, remember we calculated the typical ROI at 0.65, and 2 times the 0.65 equals 1.3. 1.3 is less than 1.8, which means the rate of improvement needed is actually twice that of what every other kid is doing. And we already know this kid is having problems. There's no way he's going to learn 2 times faster than other kids when he's still struggling. And so it's not reasonable. So although his gap was not significant, there was still a gap there. And we were able to determine how much faster the other kids were learning. It's not a lot more faster, but it is still faster than him even when he's doing the intervention. And it is unreasonable to think that by the end of the school year, he is going to catch up. So once you have that information, what do? Well, you can make the intervention happen more often. You can change it. You can change who's providing it. You can change when it's being provided or how intense it is. Maybe moving him from Tier 2 to Tier 3, or maybe moving him to special education. So here are the references for the information on the gap analysis. Hopefully this was helpful.